The lights dimmed to a muted glow as cameras swept across the studio, catching every flicker of tension like sparks off steel. Viewers at home could feel it before a word was spoken, that subtle shiver of anticipation when something unprecedented is about to happen. In the center of the stage, under the harsh spotlight, the two figures faced each other, one with the calm poise of a patient truth-teller, the other with the restless energy of someone who believed power could shield them from accountability. A hush fell, heavy and electric. Then, out of nowhere, the first verbal strike landed. It wasn't a polite disagreement, but a sharp, cutting remark designed to wound not just the person across the table, but the millions watching who saw themselves reflected in that person's dignity. The audience gasped audibly. Phones lifted to record. The host leaned forward as if gravity itself had shifted. The insult hung in the air, trembling with arrogance and entitlement. For a heartbeat, the hero didn't move. Eyes steady, breath measured, they absorbed the blow like someone who had spent a lifetime enduring far worse. Their silence was its own kind of power, a refusal to stoop, a living rebuke to the spectacle. Around them, the studio seemed to tilt, murmurs rising, hashtags forming in real time, allies exchanging looks of disbelief. The villains smirked, misunderstanding composure for weakness, misunderstanding dignity for surrender. But beneath the calm surface, a tide was building. The hero's fingers brushed the edge of the podium, not in nervousness, but in grounding, as if connecting to a deeper current of history, resilience, and the unseen support of countless people who'd been waiting for this moment. Even through the television screen, viewers could sense it. This was not just another debate soundbite. This was a challenge to the very story the villain thought they controlled. And then the hero lifted their gaze, eyes bright with a calm fire. The silence deepened, thick enough to hear the hum of the lights overhead. Every person in the room held their breath, sensing a pivot. But no one in the studio could predict how the next few minutes would reshape the entire conversation.
What had just erupted on live television wasn't a throwaway exchange. It was a collision of two visions of the country itself. For years, the villain had styled themselves as an unshakable voice of tradition, draping every argument in lofty rhetoric about real America. But behind that facade were policies and words that chipped away at the dignity of millions, especially immigrants, working families, and anyone who didn't fit a narrow mold of belonging. That's why the insult wasn't merely personal. It was a public demonstration of a deeper contempt, and millions watching at home felt it in their bones. In living rooms across the nation, viewers leaned forward. This wasn't just a debate between two politicians. It was the front line of a cultural battle over who gets to define American identity. The hero stood not only as an individual, but as a proxy for communities long told to sit down and stay quiet. The villain's barb had done more than sting. It had revealed the fault line running through the country, the gap between inclusive democracy and exclusionary power. This moment mattered because democracy itself is not only ballots and laws, it's also the stories we tell about who belongs. Every phrase on that stage was a signal, every gesture a message. And tonight, the audience could sense that one person was speaking from a place of lived experience and commitment to service, while the other was clinging to a script designed to keep the gates closed. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was a test of character under fire, broadcast live to millions. As the villain's words ricocheted across social media, comments flared with anger, disbelief, and solidarity. Hashtags began to form like storm clouds. Hashtag stand with dignity. Hashtag enough already. Influencers, journalists, and everyday people started threading their own stories of being dismissed or demeaned, and how much they craved someone, anyone, to push back with grace and clarity. It was as if a collective heartbeat had accelerated, waiting to see if the hero would rise to the moment. The stakes weren't only about reputations, they were about power itself. If the villain succeeded in framing the narrative, millions would internalize yet another story about who's worthy and who isn't. But if the hero could reframe the insult as evidence of something larger, they could expose the hollowness of the attack and shift the country's conversation about fairness, belonging, and strength. Behind the cameras, producers whispered into headsets, aware they were capturing something combustible. In group chats and Twitter threads, people typed furiously, their emojis punctuating outrage and hope alike. Even seasoned commentators were admitting on air that the exchange had cut deeper than they expected. This wasn't just television. It was a referendum on a vision of America. And somewhere within the hero's steady posture, there was a hint, just a flicker, that they had been preparing for this very scenario, that they had a story, a truth, an example so undeniable that it could pierce through the noise. The villain's arrogance had cracked open a door, and on the other side was a revelation that could flip the power dynamic entirely. The studio lights glared hotter, cameras zoomed closer, and the crowd pressed in with an almost physical anticipation. Every second stretched, every breath became a countdown. Something was about to emerge, something that would transform a stinging insult into an unforgettable turning point. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, a backstory emerged that flipped the narrative.
Long before the bright lights of the studio, the villain had built a reputation on bluster and bravado. Born into comfort, they crafted a public image of grit and authenticity, but their rise was powered by a talent for provocation rather than principle. In hometown speeches, they wrapped themselves in flags and slogans, promising to restore order and protect real Americans. Yet behind closed doors, they treated policy like a game board, moving pieces to favor allies and punish dissenters, all while cultivating a sense of untouchability. Their early campaigns were a masterclass in selective storytelling. They highlighted an image of blue-collar roots, carefully omitting the financial lifelines and connections that smoothed every obstacle. They proclaimed support for working families, even as they voted against wage protections. They invoked freedom while endorsing measures to restrict who could vote. This double life became their brand, a slick performance of populism that masked a hunger for status and control. Former staffers would later describe their private demeanor as icy and calculating. They never forgot a slight, one aide recalled in a leaked memoir. Every decision was about optics, not people. Yet on stage, the villain could summon fiery indignation at will, casting themselves as the lone defender of tradition against an encroaching tide of diversity and change. They understood how fear moved crowds, and they wielded it like a conductor's baton. The contradictions piled up like bricks in a wall. While railing against government handouts, they accepted lucrative tax breaks and subsidies for their own businesses. While championing family values, they had been dogged by scandals and accusations of double standards. And while claiming to speak for the forgotten, they consistently dismissed immigrant communities, women, and young activists as troublemakers or outsiders. In one infamous episode, the villain had stood before a town hall of mostly immigrant families and declared, "If you can't handle our culture, you don't belong here." The words had echoed like a slap, and the video went viral, igniting protests and think pieces. Yet rather than backtrack, they doubled down, relishing the outrage as proof of their authenticity. Each new controversy became a stepping stone to greater media attention, which they spun into more influence. Colleagues noticed the pattern. The villain thrived on escalation, creating conflicts they could then claim to resolve. They would inflame debates about national identity, then appear on cable news as the voice of reason, all while edging policies toward exclusion. They see people as chess pieces, another insider said. Every headline is a calculation, every insult a setup for the next act. Even their debating style reflected this cynicism. Rather than engage with facts, they wielded interruptions, smirks, and insinuations to destabilize opponents. They treated dignity as a weakness to be exploited. The tactic worked, until it met someone who refused to flinch. As the cameras rolled that night, viewers at home began to recognize the familiar pattern. The smirk, the baiting tone, the cutting remark, all part of the villain's long-practiced choreography. But this time, something felt different. The insult had landed, yes, but instead of folding under pressure, the person across from them remained steady, eyes locked, a calm presence against a whirlwind of swagger. That steadiness unnerved the villain. Underneath the polished veneer of confidence, there was a flicker of unease. They had built their career on assumptions about who would shrink, who would stay silent. But now, confronted with someone who had lived the stakes they only performed, their arsenal of tricks felt suddenly insufficient. Outside the studio, the villain's record was being dissected in real time. Journalists tweeted out their voting history, side by side with their soundbites. Activists resurfaced old clips that contradicted their statements. Memes juxtaposed their populist slogans with luxury vacations and donor dinners. It wasn't just a narrative shift. It was the unmasking of a long-standing performance. Yet in that moment, the villains still believed they could steer the story. Their voice grew louder, their gestures sharper, as though sheer force could drown out truth. They leaned forward, eyes glittering with the familiar thrill of domination. But the cameras caught it, the tiniest tremor in their hand, the micro-expression of someone sensing the tide turning against them. And as the viewers leaned closer, sensing the unraveling, a new question began to rise. Who exactly was the person sitting across from this practiced provocateur? What history, what fire, what experience gave them the composure to hold their ground? But while the cameras focused on the villain, the true story of the hero was waiting to be told.
Long before they stood beneath the blinding lights of a national broadcast, the hero's life was lit by humbler, harder flames. They grew up in a small apartment above a corner store, where the smell of fresh bread mingled with the metallic scent of factory dust from the street outside. Their parents had arrived in the country with little more than their faith in possibility, working double shifts to keep the family afloat. From childhood, the hero absorbed a lesson that would later shape every decision. Dignity does not come from being handed power. It's earned by showing up, by enduring, by lifting others as you climb. Their earliest memories were of translating for elders at doctors' offices, of advocating for parents when landlords tried to cheat them, of walking home from school past billboards that suggested success was for someone else. Yet even then, there was a flicker of defiance, a sense that belonging wasn't granted from above, but built from within. Teachers saw it in their eyes when they defended classmates from bullies, in the way they raised the hand not to be noticed, but to clarify, to seek understanding, to demand fairness. College was another gauntlet. Working nights while taking full course loads, the hero studied political science not for prestige, but as a manual on how power operated, how it could be confronted and reimagined. They organized food drives, campus forums, and voter registration events. They earned a reputation for listening first and acting with precision, a style rooted not in theatrics, but in respect. By the time they graduated, they had already been arrested once for peaceful protest, a mugshot they would later frame as a reminder of the stakes. Public service wasn't an accident, it was an inheritance. They took jobs in legal aid clinics, then in city government, fighting quietly for policies that most voters never saw, but that changed lives.
eviction prevention programs, language access in public schools, protections for immigrant workers. They weren't the kind of leader who treated office as a stage, they treated it as a tool. And yet precisely because of that authenticity, their profile grew. People recognized something rare, a representative who mirrored their struggles, who seemed to carry their stories on their shoulders rather than in their slogans. When they eventually ran for national office, the campaign wasn't powered by corporate money, but by grassroots volunteers, many of them first-time donors, sending $5 or $10 at a time. They campaigned in community centers, barbershops, and small town halls, telling their own story not as a resume, but as an invitation. If my family could endure, so can yours. If my voice can break through, so can yours. Their speeches didn't soar so much as steady, rooted, clear, resolute. And it worked. The night they won, an older woman in the crowd wept, saying, "I feel seen for the first time in my life." This history of struggle and service built a discipline few could match. It taught them to recognize manipulation, to measure their tone under pressure, and to hold their ground without flinching. It gave them empathy that couldn't be faked and a calm that couldn't be rattled. By the time they faced the villain on that debate stage, they had already faced down xenophobic hecklers at town halls, lobbyists in closed-door meetings, and bureaucracies designed to exhaust rather than empower. Each trial had been a rehearsal for the moment unfolding on live TV. Friends described the hero as someone who carries their community with them, figuratively and literally. Their office walls are lined with photos of local activists, family elders, and ordinary citizens whose struggles inspired legislation. When they walk into a debate, they are not walking alone. They are bringing countless unseen allies. That sense of collective identity infuses their poise, an unshakable knowledge that the stakes are bigger than personal reputation. Critically, the hero also learned the power of story, not spin, but story, the ability to connect a single anecdote to a universal principle. They knew that if they could place one human face at the center of an abstract policy, hearts and minds would shift. This skill would soon become their sharpest tool on that stage. On the night of the broadcast, all these threads converged. The immigrant childhood, the legal aid battles, the grassroots campaigns, the steady insistence on dignity, it all lived in their posture, their measured breathing, their unbroken eye contact. Viewers might not have known every detail of their biography, but they felt it, the way you feel the hidden roots beneath a towering tree. And as the villain continued their performance, the hero held an entire lifetime of resilience like an arrow on a bowstring, waiting for the right moment to release. The audience sensed it without quite knowing why, that the person standing before them wasn't improvising under pressure, but fulfilling a destiny forged in struggle. All those years of preparation had led to this precise instant. Every hardship, every victory, every scar had crystallized into a clarity no insult could penetrate. And with that foundation, what unfolded on live TV became inevitable.
The studio air felt charged, as though the oxygen itself had thinned. After the hero's quiet resilience, the villains sensed their control of the stage slipping and began to push harder. Their voice rose in volume and pitch, each syllable landing like a hammer. "You don't understand real America," they sneered, jabbing a finger toward the hero as the camera zoomed in. "You're just here to lecture, not to listen." The words were meant to sting, but instead of crumbling, the hero stood motionless, hands resting lightly on the podium, eyes steady. A ripple passed through the audience, a collective gasp, followed by hushed whispers. Some craned forward in their seats, others exchanged glances filled with disbelief. Social media feeds began to spike again, hashtags flashing across screens in living rooms, hashtag hero keeps calm, hashtag villain meltdown. Even the moderator shifted uncomfortably, sensing the exchange had left the realm of ordinary debate and entered something more primal, more revealing. The villain, emboldened by the sound of their own voice, pressed on. "You talk about community and values," they barked, "but you're nothing but a fraud." Their hand slammed against the podium, the microphone capturing the thud. The gesture was meant to intimidate, but the optics told another story, a portrait of desperation against an opponent radiating composure. Through it all, the hero maintained a measured rhythm of breath, shoulders squared but relaxed, gaze unbroken. They knew the villain's tactics by heart: escalate, provoke, repeat. And they also knew the deeper truth, that when arrogance hits a wall of dignity, it begins to devour itself. Their silence now acted as a mirror, reflecting every excess of the villain back onto them. A tense murmur rose from the crowd, as if the entire studio were holding its breath. One young audience member clapped once sharply, then stopped, realizing the gravity of the moment. The cameras cut to a wide shot of the stage, the villain leaning forward, face flushed, the hero upright and calm, a pillar of resolute. It was no longer a debate, but a tableau, a living symbol of two competing visions of leadership. In the control room, producers whispered urgently into headsets, debating which camera angle best captured the villain's unraveling. On social media, clips were already circulating, side-by-side shots of the villain's reddened face and the hero's serene expression. Commentators began to post, "This is a masterclass in composure under fire," while others wrote, "The mask is slipping." The villain tried another tack, mocking the hero's background. "You think hardship makes you superior? This is America. We pull ourselves up. We don't whine." The audience reacted with a low groan, a mix of disbelief and disapproval. The hero's lips pressed together in a faint, knowing smile, not of smugness, but of someone who's heard this refrain before and outlasted it every time. As the tension mounted, the energy shifted palpably. The villain's gestures became more erratic, their words tumbling over each other. The hero began to lean in ever so slightly, a subtle sign of engagement, like a conductor about to lift the baton. Their calm now felt less like defense and more like coiled power, a readiness to strike with precision rather than scattershot rage. Every second stretched, every breath deepened the contrast. The villain's monologue spun into contradictions, quoting past statements they themselves had disavowed, while the hero quietly noted the inconsistencies with a raised eyebrow. This was the moment the viewing public began to sense it, the balance of power shifting before their eyes. And still, the hero spoke not a word. They waited, allowing the villain to build their own trap. In living rooms across the nation, viewers sat on the edge of their couches, gripping remote controls, whispering to themselves, "When will they answer? What are they about to say?" The suspense was its own form of electricity, binding the audience to the screen. Then came a pause. The villain's rant ran out of steam. The studio fell into a strange, echoing quiet, as if the walls themselves were listening. The hero inhaled slowly, tilting their head just enough to signal that the silence was over, that their turn had arrived. But no one could predict the precision strike the hero was about to deliver.
For a moment, the entire room felt suspended in air, as though the collective inhale of the audience had pulled time to a standstill. The villain's last insult still echoed across the stage, but its sting had already dulled, replaced by an electric sense that something irreversible was about to happen. The hero lifted their eyes from the podium and met the villain's gaze, a quiet fire behind their steady composure. When they finally spoke, their voice was calm but resonant, each word landing like a drumbeat in the stillness. "You keep telling us who belongs," the hero began, their tone measured. "But I grew up believing America belongs to all of us, including families like mine, who came here with nothing but hope." The words weren't delivered as a rebuke, they arrived as a testimony, charged with authenticity rather than anger. The villain blinked, momentarily thrown off by the shift in tone, and the cameras caught it, that flicker of unease, like a boxer realizing their opponent isn't winded at all, but has been waiting to counter. The hero continued, weaving their own story into a broader indictment. They spoke of their parents working nights, of studying by a flickering lamp, of translating legal documents for neighbors, of believing in a democracy that promised equality even when the evidence was scarce. Each example was precise, unexaggerated, and devastatingly relatable. "That's why I ran for office," they said softly. "Because for too long, people like you have mistaken power for permission. We don't need permission to exist, to work, to raise our children with dignity. We are here. We have always been here." A low murmur rippled through the studio audience, building into a chorus of applause that the producers had to dampen for broadcast. On social media, viewers typed in real time, "This is it. Chills. That line will go down in history." Hashtags exploded, pushing the broadcast into trending territory within minutes. The villains shifted their weight, the smirk gone, their lips pressed into a thin line. Then came the moment no one expected. The hero reached under the podium and lifted a folder of documents, a gesture so simple yet so deliberate it silenced the audience anew. The hero said, "You've been saying my community takes without giving," holding up the papers. "But these are your voting records, your speeches, your donations, the proof that you've built your career on taking from the very people you claim to defend." They began reading excerpts aloud, quoting the villain's own statements from past interviews, juxtaposed with contradictory votes on policy. Each citation was a brick in a wall of hypocrisy, and with each one, the villain's posture sagged a little more. The audience gasped at the precision, the timing, the composure. "You told farmers you'd protect their livelihoods, but you cut the programs that kept their businesses alive. You promised workers a fair wage, but you blocked every raise. You spoke of faith and family, but mocked immigrant children seeking asylum." A gasp gave way to a roar of applause. The villain's face flushed deep red, their hands fidgeting with their notes, eyes darting to the moderator for rescue that never came. The hero paused, letting the silence expand before delivering the next blow. "I am not here to trade insults. I am here to tell the truth. And the truth is, your power depends on dividing us, but we're done being divided." The studio's energy shifted. It was no longer a debate stage, but an impromptu courtroom, the hero presenting evidence to a jury of millions. Even the camera seemed to lean in, cutting tighter on the villain's face as the composure drained from it. Commentators in the press box exchanged glances, already drafting their headlines. One whispered audibly into a mic, "We're witnessing a historic dismantling." Yet the hero wasn't finished. They placed the folder back down, folded their hands, and with a quiet intensity said, "I want you to look at me, and by looking at me, see the millions of Americans you've dismissed. We're not a footnote in your speech. We are the story." The villain finally raised their eyes, and for the first time all night their expression held no contempt, only calculation, the desperate scramble for a counterpunch that wouldn't come. The audience erupted in applause, some rising from their seats. The moderator tried to restore order, but the energy was uncontainable. Clips were already being clipped and shared online with captions like, "The moment everything changed," and "This is how you handle a bully." The hero's words began to take on the quality of a movement rather than a retort. Still, the hero maintained their composure, pivoting from confrontation to vision. "I don't just stand here to call out your contradictions. I stand here to remind everyone watching that this country is bigger than fear, bigger than scapegoating, bigger than cynicism. And if we act together, it's bigger than you." They didn't raise their voice, but the effect was seismic. The villain, visibly rattled,
shuffled their papers, and muttered a protest no one could quite hear. Media commentators scrambled to capture the moment. Some called it a masterclass, others a political earthquake. In newsroom panels across the country, anchors interrupted other segments to cut back to the debate, marveling at the reversal of momentum. Influencers spliced the speech with footage of civil rights marches, immigrant families arriving at airports, and crowds cheering. The hero's calm became the narrative, eclipsing every insult that preceded it. As the applause finally died down, the hero looked directly into the camera, their eyes steady and luminous. To everyone watching at home, you matter. Your story matters, and no one, not even those in power, can erase it. It wasn't just a sign-off. It was an invitation, a collective exhale, a reminder that democracy's strength lies in its people, not its politicians. The villain tried one last time to interject, but the moderator moved on, signaling the moment had passed. In that instant, viewers across the nation sensed it. A tide had shifted. The old script of intimidation and dismissal had met a force it couldn't bend. And as the cameras pulled back to a wide shot of the stage, the villains slumped behind their podium, the hero poised and still, the gravity of what had just happened settled in. This wasn't merely a debate win, it was a public unmasking, a reclamation of narrative, a seismic turning point in the larger struggle over identity, power, and truth. And the ripple effects didn't stop there.
Within minutes of the broadcast ending, the digital world erupted like a storm front colliding with warm air. Clips of the hero's counterattack flooded timelines, each one edited, subtitled, remixed, and shared with captions like "a masterclass in courage" and "finally, someone stood up." Hashtag soared to the top of trending lists, hashtag we are the story, hashtag mic drop moment, and hashtag hero versus villain, turning a single debate segment into a national phenomenon. On TikTok, creators stitched the speech with their own tears, cheers, and personal testimonies. On Twitter, journalists posted side-by-side screenshots of the hero's composure against the villain's collapse, creating instant memes that ricocheted across the globe. Late-night comedians opened their shows with parodies of the villain's meltdown, playing the clip of their flushed face on a loop, spliced with dramatic sound effects and laugh tracks. One joked, "I've seen milk expire slower than that composure." Meanwhile, progressive commentators treated the hero's performance as a watershed moment. This wasn't just a debate, one wrote, it was a transfer of narrative power, from fear to dignity. Celebrities chimed in too. An Oscar-winning actor posted a selfie with the caption, "Standing with dignity tonight," while a Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "That line will be taught in civics classes someday." Even a handful of moderate pundits, normally skeptical of confrontation, acknowledged the clarity and moral force of the hero's words. Polling firms scrambled to measure the public opinion swing, but the real numbers were already visible in the reaction videos. Countless ordinary people wiping their eyes, pumping their fists, or calling their relatives to say, "Did you see that?" In immigrant neighborhoods from coast to coast, local cafes replayed the clip on loop, customers leaning over their coffee to savor each pause and phrase. In suburban living rooms, parents told their kids, "That's what standing up looks like." In classrooms, teachers pulled up the video as an example of composure under pressure. The hero's calm had become a kind of shorthand for dignity, a way of reminding people of their own capacity for resolve. Memes became their own kind of campaign. One showed the villain's red-faced outburst, captioned "The Old Playbook," next to the hero's steady gaze, captioned "The New Era." Another overlaid the hero's quote, "We are not a footnote in your speech, we are the story," on images of marches, protests, and family portraits, turning it into an emblem of collective identity. Each meme was like a digital sticker slapped on the crumbling facade of the villain's invincibility. Cable news segments replayed the exchange hourly,
One conservative network tried to downplay the moment, but ended up airing it repeatedly, inadvertently boosting the hero's reach. Progressive outlets called it the speech of a generation. Even apolitical morning shows marveled at the composure and the unexpected role reversal on live television. By dawn, the debate had eclipsed every other headline. But the shift wasn't just online. Donations to grassroots organizations aligned with the hero's policies spiked overnight. Small-town newspapers that rarely covered national politics ran front-page editorials praising the authenticity and courage on display. Former rivals publicly expressed admiration, saying the moment raised the bar for public discourse. The villains team, meanwhile, went into damage control mode, issuing contradictory statements, blaming the moderator, and claiming the clips were taken out of context, yet the footage spoke for itself, uncut, unspinnable. What made the shockwave so potent wasn't only the spectacle, it was the sense of vindication. For years, audiences had watched bullies dominate stages, rewarded for their bluster. Now, in a single night, that pattern was inverted. People who had felt invisible saw themselves reflected in the hero's poise, and it changed how they felt about their own power. Even international media took note. A European newspaper ran the headline, "Composure Defeats Demagoguery," and a South American broadcaster called it a masterclass in democratic courage. Hashtags translated into multiple languages, carrying the hero's words far beyond U.S. borders. The debate had started as a domestic skirmish, but ended as a global signal that dignity can still command attention. Meanwhile, the villain's brand began to fray. Sponsors quietly distanced themselves. Allies in their own party issued tepid defenses or conspicuous silence. Pollsters reported a dip in favorability ratings, particularly among independents and younger voters. Where once the villain had dictated the conversation, now they were chasing it, reacting instead of commanding. And yet, amid all the virality, the hero stayed grounded. They posted a simple message the next morning. "This was never about me, it's about us." It was a reminder that the performance on stage had been backed by years of service and struggle, not manufactured outrage. The humility only amplified the impact. Still, everyone sensed there was more to come. The speech wasn't just a closing argument, it was an opening salvo. The online buzz, the headlines, the memes, they were powerful, but they were also just the surface ripples of something deeper. Because at its core, the moment had been about values, not spectacle. And values have a way of echoing long after the feeds refresh. But the final chapter of this story wasn't written on social media. It was written in the values the hero stood for.
As the dust of the debate settled, a quieter power began to surface. Not in the hashtags or the late-night punchlines, but in the unspoken recognition spreading through living rooms and community halls. The hero had not only answered an attack, they had reframed the entire question of what leadership looks like. No longer was it about who could shout the loudest or strike the cruelest blow. It had become about who could hold dignity under fire and turned pain into principle. In interviews the next morning, pundits tried to capture the essence of what viewers had witnessed. Some called it the return of integrity, others the triumph of composure. But the deeper shift was more elemental. People saw, perhaps for the first time in years, that courage can be calm, and that service can be stronger than self-interest. In a climate saturated with cynicism, the hero had demonstrated that dignity isn't weakness, it's an unassailable form of strength. This transformation reached beyond politics. Parents replayed the clip for their children, framing it as a lesson in how to stand up to bullies without losing one's soul. Teachers discussed it in classrooms as an example of values in action. Faith leaders quoted the hero's lines in sermons about compassion and justice. Each retelling turned the moment into a parable about resilience, proof that character can still cut through noise. And while the villain's supporters scrambled to spin the exchange, the hero's message transcended party or label. We are not a footnote, we are the story. Those words became a rallying cry, not just for immigrants or progressives, but for anyone who had ever felt dismissed or devalued. In that sense, the debate ceased to be an isolated incident and became a mirror, reflecting a larger struggle over what America chooses to honor: fear or fairness, bluster or service. The hero, for their part, remained consistent. In a small press conference days later, they refused to gloat or escalate. Instead, they spoke softly about the need to heal divisions and build coalitions rooted in truth. They thanked their supporters, but redirected the spotlight toward community organizers, volunteers, and the everyday citizens who inspired them to run. It was a deliberate rejection of spectacle, a return to substance. This composure deepened the public's respect. Commentators noted how unusual it was to see a leader use their viral moment not to entrench power, but to expand empathy. They didn't just win the debate, they modeled a different kind of politics. The leader's approach reinforced a universal moral lesson: that dignity outlasts outrage and service outshines selfish ambition. More profoundly, the confrontation illuminated a timeless truth about democracy itself. The villain had tried to weaponize belonging as a gate, to pit one group against another. The hero had reminded the country that belonging is not a privilege granted by power, but a right inherent in humanity. It was a turning of the lens, from exclusion to inclusion, from hierarchy to shared stake. In doing so, they gave voice to a quiet majority who still believe in a country big enough for all. This was the cinematic crescendo people had been waiting for, not a spectacle of rage, but a revelation of principle. The hero's steady posture became a kind of civic heartbeat, reminding audiences that politics is not a blood sport, but a shared endeavor. The applause in the studio was just the echo of something larger, a collective yearning to replace cynicism with hope, noise with meaning. And as the hero concluded their remarks in that press conference, they offered a single line that crystallized the entire experience. Dignity is not negotiable. Service is not weakness, and justice is not for the few, it's for all of us. The words landed softly but reverberated deeply, a counterpoint to the villain's bluster, a north star for those watching. In the weeks to come, this moral reframing would continue to ripple outward, shaping conversations in workplaces, families, and policy circles. But even in that first moment after the debate, before the think pieces and the polls, people felt it, the sense that they had witnessed not just a clash of personalities, but a glimpse of what politics could be at its best. And as the lights dimmed and the camera stopped rolling, one truth echoed louder than all the headlines.
What began as a single shocking exchange on live television had become something far larger, a reminder of what it looks like when courage meets contempt and refuses to break. From the opening moments of the debate, when the villain's insults rang out and the hero stood unshaken, through the mic drop counterattack and the nationwide ripple effect, the story you've just watched has been about more than a political clash. It's about dignity over hate, service over self-interest, belonging over exclusion. This is why the moment matters, and why it's worth remembering. Because the stakes revealed that night aren't confined to one studio or one election cycle. They're part of a larger struggle about who we are as a country. Each time we share, comment, or talk about these stories, we're not just rehashing headlines, we're building a collective sense of what we will and will not tolerate. We're shaping the narrative of our own future. So if this story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in the hero's composure, or in the millions who demanded something better, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who doubts that dignity can win. Add your voice to a movement that insists on empathy, courage, and truth as non-negotiables in public life. Together, we can amplify stories that challenge arrogance and lift up the quiet power of integrity. In the end, this isn't only about a debate moment. It's about us, about the communities, families, and values we carry forward. And as long as we keep showing up, telling our stories, and standing together, no insult can erase our dignity and no villain can define our future.